Hey now. Today we're going to talk about Wonder Boy. And no, I don't mean the song by Tenacious D. As delightful as that is, we're going to talk about the game series. Wonder Boy is interesting because it started off as a fairly simple arcade platformer, where the goal was nothing more glorious than to get to the end of a stage before your power ran out or you got killed, with a decidedly prehistoric setting into a more action-adventure series, with strong RPG elements and a medieval setting. What makes it even more interesting is that there are in fact 3 series to talk about. The main series, a series within the series, and a spin-off series. The original game was simply titled Wonder Boy, and was developed by Escape and published by SEGA. It was an arcade game in which you played as a caveman named Tom Tom, who was on an adventure to rescue his girlfriend Tanya, and mostly you had to fight animals such as snails and snakes, and use power-ups such as a hatchet and, oddly enough, a skateboard. The game was popular and wound up being ported to many home consoles and computers. It wound up on the Atari ST, the SEGA SG-1000, the Master System, the Commodore 64, the Amstrad CPC, the ZX Spectrum, the Game Gear, and the NES, and the Master System version was released for the Wii Virtual Console. Most of the ports are pretty much what you'd expect, but this is where it gets interesting, as there were name changes, and in one case, graphics and story changes to the ports. The SG-1000 port was actually a completely different game due to the difficulty of porting an arcade game to Sega's console. The game had redrawn graphics and completely new stages, and was missing a few enemies, and did not have the skateboard power-up. The Master System version was the one that most people are familiar with, though for some odd reason in Japan it was called Super Wonder Boy, which would make you think of it being an enhanced version or a sequel, but it is in fact neither. In America, it's simply known as Wonder Boy. The Game Gear version is also very interesting. As you might know, the Game Gear is basically nothing more glorious than a handheld Master System, which is the reason that games are usually released for both, and were almost always identical. The Game Gear had a slightly broader color palette, but it pretty much was the Master System. So, although the Game Gear Wonder Boy is pretty much the same thing as the Master System one, it was oddly enough renamed Revenge of Drankon. Most interesting of all, though, is the NES version. The original developer, Escape, teamed up with Hudson Soft to make the NES version. However, the original publisher, SEGA, held exclusive rights to the Wonder Boy trademark and was unwilling to allow the trademark to be used on a Nintendo system, especially that they were using Wonder Boy as a sort of mascot at the time along with Alex Kidd. So they stripped the name Wonder Boy and changed the protagonist to a look-alike, and changed a few of the graphics, but for the most part it was the same game. The result was Master Takahashi's Adventure Island, which in America was shortened to just Adventure Island, where the protagonist was named Master Higgins. This is the first part at which the series splits off into another, so we'll talk about this first. Hudson had great success with Adventure Island and spun it off into their own series. While the Wonder Boy series became increasingly more RPG-like and moved into a medieval setting, Hudson kept the prehistoric tapestry and simple platforming gameplay, at least for most of the releases. And interestingly enough, while the Wonder Boy series of games remained mostly on Sega consoles, the Adventure Island series remained mostly on Nintendo consoles. The Adventure Island version of the game was also released for the MSX. The NES version showed up on the Game Boy Advance as part of the project to release old NES games on there, and a remake showed up in Japan as Hudson Select Volume 4 Master Takahashi's Adventure Island for PlayStation 2 and GameCube. Finally, the NES version showed up on the Wii Virtual Console. So, before we go back to Wonder Boy, let's run through the Adventure Island series. The next game came out for the NES and Game Boy. In Japan, it's known as Great Takahashi's Adventure Island 2, and in America, simply Adventure Island 2 on the NES, and Adventure Island on the Game Boy, as it was the first Game Boy game. The Game Boy version has recently showed up on the 3DS Virtual Console. The series next jumped to the 16-bit Super NES. In Japan, the next game was called Great Takahashi's Great Adventure Island, and in America it was called Super Adventure Island. This is not to be confused with the Super Adventure Island that came out for mobile phones years later, which was a remake of the second Wonder Boy game. I'll get to that later. Super Adventure Island also made its way to the Virtual Console on the Wii. The next entry was the first to not be released on a Nintendo system, New Adventure Island for the TurboGrafx-16. In Japan, it's called Great Takahashi's New Adventure Island. It did eventually wind up on a Nintendo console, though, in the form of the Wii Virtual Console, and it was also released for PSN. Even though the series had already jumped to 16-bit, the next one goes back to 8-bit. It was released for NES and Game Boy, in Japan as Great Takahashi's Adventure Island 3, in America simply Adventure Island 3, and for the Game Boy, Adventure Island 2, as it was the second game on the Game Boy. A common misconception is that Super Adventure Island came out after all of the NES games, but in fact Adventure Island 3 came out later in the same year. The next game is interesting. It was only released in Japan for the Famicom as Master Takahashi's Adventure Island 4. This one retained the same core dynamics, but was more of an adventure game, with an open world to explore and having to find items and defeat bosses to gain access to new areas. It's sort of similar to Metroid or later Castlevania games. Even though it's a great game and easily the best 8-bit game in the series, it sadly never came out in America or was ever released for any other system. Now let's head back to the Super NES with Super Adventure Island 2, which in Japan is called Master Takahashi's Great Adventure Island 2. This was the last one in the series for a while. This one actually had more RPG elements, including an overworld and random battles, although it would go side-scrolling for the battles, sort of similar to Zelda 2. This was exclusive to the Super NES and later wound up on the Wii Virtual Console. The Adventure Island games disappeared for a long time after that, for the most part because of how different and unusual Super Adventure Island 2 was, which didn't exactly help the game's sales. The last game in the series was Adventure Island The Beginning for WiiWare, which in Japan is called Master Takahashi's Adventure Island Wii. This one took the series back to its roots, but with 3D graphics similar to the PlayStation 2 and GameCube remake of the original game. So, to clear up the order that these games came out in, first there was Adventure Island, then Adventure Island 2, which on Game Boy is called Adventure Island, then Super Adventure Island, then New Adventure Island, then Adventure Island 3, which is called 2 on the Game Boy, then Adventure Island 4, though that one was never released in America, then Super Adventure Island 2, and then Adventure Island The Beginning. So now that that's handled, let's go back to Wonder Boy. The sequel to Wonder Boy was handled by different people. The original developer, Escape, had nothing to do with it. Instead, it was developed by SEGA and Westone. The game was released initially for arcades, like the original, and was called Wonder Boy in Monsterland. This one switched to a medieval setting and more adventure style of gameplay, which would become normal for the series. Ports of the game were released for the Master System, Commodore 64, Famicom, PC Engine, Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum, Amiga, Atari ST, and mobile phones. The arcade version would also show up on both the Wii Virtual Console and PlayStation Network. Once again, several ports were released with different titles. The PC Engine version could not be called Wonder Boy due to SEGA owning the trademark, so instead they changed the game up, similar to the way Hudson changed the first game, to resemble a popular anime series of the time, Bikuramon, and it was released as simply Bikuramon, or in English it would be Journey to the West. The Sega Master System version also had an odd name. At least in America, it was called Super Wonder Boy Super Monsterland. Jeez, is that super enough? In Europe, the Master System version is called Super Wonder Boy Monster World. I guess that one was slightly less super. There was also a Brazilian release which changed the game to resemble a Brazilian comic known as Monica's Gang. The game was released there as Monica in the Castle of the Dragon. The Famicom version also couldn't be called Wonder Boy due to the trademark issue, so that one was released as Saiyuki World. There were later two separate releases for mobile phones. The first was simply a port that came out in 2005, and the second was made by Hudson, who called the game Super Adventure Island, not to be confused with their Super Adventure Island for Super NES. Interestingly, although it was the second game in the Wonder Boy series, it's also the first game in the Monster World series, which for the most part runs parallel. This gets confusing, as it led to two separate games being called Wonder Boy 3. Let's talk about the first one. The first one, which is the official third Wonder Boy game, is Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair, which was developed by Westone and published by SEGA. Although this one is Monster Boy 3, it regresses a bit, uses the prehistoric setting rather than the medieval one. Although the hero still uses a sword, it was used to fire shots rather than as a melee weapon. This one also ditches the adventure aspects and goes back to being a platformer, though is an auto-scrolling platformer and the only game in the series to offer multiplayer, as a second player can join in as the princess. In other words, it's a very arcade type of game. Because of these differences, it's part of the Wonder Boy series, but is not part of the Monster World series. The game was initially released for arcades, but unlike the first two, there weren't a shit ton of home ports. This time there were only a few. The game was released for the TurboGrafx 16 Super CD-ROM, although the American release of this version changed the title to simply Monster Lair, as it was not a SEGA system, which led to many people not realizing that it was a third Wonder Boy game. There was also a Genesis version, or I should say Mega Drive, as it didn't come out in America, but only Japan and Europe. Americans can, however, get the Virtual Console version, or I should say versions, as both the TurboGrafx version and the Genesis version showed up there, and both saw American releases. Now, as I mentioned, Wonder Boy and Monsterland was part 2 of the Wonder Boy series, but also part 1 of the Monster World series. And next, they planned to spin Monster World off into its own series, but it didn't exactly work out well. The original plan was to release it for the Master System as Monster World 2 Dragon Trap. However, by the time it was done, the Master System was pretty much dead in Japan, though it still had some success elsewhere, particularly in Europe. So the original version was actually not released in Japan, but only in America and Europe. The American Master System release took the name Wonder Boy 3 The Dragon's Trap, though it's not the third Wonder Boy game, but in fact the fourth. But as the official Wonder Boy 3, Monster Lair was not released on the Master System, as far as American and European fans knew, this was the third Monster Boy game for that system. Hence, it was called 3. When looking at the chronology of the series, you'll notice that there are 2 number 3s and then it skips to 5. So now you know. Monster Lair is the real Part 3, and Dragon's Trap is actually Part 4. It was later brought to the TurboGrafx 16, but things didn't get easier, as this was not a SEGA system, and therefore they couldn't use the name Wonder Boy. For some reason, the Japanese TurboGrafx version was called Adventure Island, despite the fact that it had nothing to do with the Hudson series. So, if you're looking for New Adventure Island for TurboGrafx, make sure you don't confuse it with Adventure Island, which is not part of that series, and is in fact the Japanese name of the fourth Wonder Boy game. In America, the TurboGrafx version is just simply called Dragon's Curse. The game also made it to Game Gear, which in all regions is simply called Wonder Boy 3 Dragon's Trap, despite that there was no Wonder Boy 2 on the Game Gear. So, it's the fourth Wonder Boy game, despite being named 3, and it's also part 2 of the Monster World series. Because it's in the Monster World series, the game once again reverts to being a medieval adventure game with RPG elements. So let's plow onwards. The next game in the series is the 5th in the Wonder Boy series, and the 3rd in the Monster World series. Hence, the insanely logical, yet insanely confusing title, Wonder Boy 5 Monster World 3. Yes, they really called it that, at least in Japan. This one came out initially for 2 systems, the Genesis and the TurboGrafx 16. The Genesis version, as I mentioned in Japan, was known as Wonder Boy 5 Monster World 3, but in America they changed the title to Wonder Boy in Monster World. Be sure you don't confuse that with Wonder Boy in Monster Land, which was the second game, first in the Monster World series. The TurboGrafx version, of course, had to be called something else, and this time they called it the Dynastic Hero. Hey, whatever floats your boat. The only other oddity is that there was actually a Master System version which was not released in Japan, nor in America, but was exclusive to Europe. The Genesis version of the game later showed up on both the Virtual Console and PSN. The Virtual Console version was available in all regions, while the PSN one only came out in America and Europe. Wonder Boy 5 Monster World 3 officially ends the Wonder Boy series, But there's one more game in the Monster World series, which is simply titled Monster World 4. I'm guessing they didn't call this one Wonder Boy because the protagonist is a girl, though unlike the previous Monster World games, it doesn't take place in a fantasy medieval setting, but in more of an Arabian setting, and it's more stripped down and action-based than the previous games. In any case, Monster World 4 was exclusive to both the Mega Drive and to Japan, not being released in any of the regions until many years later when it hit the Wii Virtual Console and PSN. Actually, so far, those versions have only hit Japan, but American and European releases are planned, as well as a release on Xbox Live Arcade. So, there you have it. Hopefully this clears up the monumentally confusing mess that comprises Wonder Boy, Adventure Island, and Monster World. Join me next time and we'll talk about something a bit easier, though still a point of contention for some people, the venerable Dragon Quest series.